Her father sold her to a cruel cattle baron for being too fat, but a quiet rancher saved her. The sun sagged low over the flat-bellied plains, spilling a dull honey light across the dusted yard where the fence posts leaned like old men weary of standing. Cora May Carson stood at the edge of that fence, her boots sunk deep into the dry earth, her fingers curled around a strand of barbed wire that bit into her skin. She didn't flinch. The sting felt honest. More honest than the words she'd heard spoken through the cracked parlor door an hour earlier. She had broad hips and a belly soft from years of living, not lounging. Arms strong from hoisting water buckets and hauling hay, not porcelain daintiness. Her dresses pulled across her curves, and the village seamstress always sighed when fitting her, measuring not with tape, but with a quiet judgment that draped heavier than cloth. She'd learned not to mind. Or rather, she'd learned how to act like she didn't. The prairie wind combed through her hair, lifting dark strands into the amber evening. Somewhere behind her, a rooster crowed late, confused by the color of the sky. Her world had always been like that, things making noise at the wrong time, beauty arriving when no one asked for it, and leaving just as sudden. Inside the house, the voices had dropped, but the damage had already carved its name into her ribs. Too fat. That's what her father had said. Like she wasn't standing 10 feet away, like her ears were stuffed with straw. He'd said it to the man in the wide-brimmed hat with eyes like wet coal and a mouth that curled at only one end, never the good one. The man had come on a white mare dusted with sweat, his boots too clean for honest work. Not much of a dowry, her father had muttered, scratching at his temple. But she's strong. She works. Eats too much, sure, but the weight's useful. Mule of a girl, really. The man hadn't laughed, just flicked the dust from his cuffs and said, "I'll take her." And just like that, she'd been bartered off like a surplus plow, traded for a corner parcel of land and $200 in war notes. Now the house was quieter, her fate carved clean, and still her father hadn't looked her in the eye. Her mother had died 5 winters ago. Pneumonia, Bates said. But Cora knew it was more than sickness. It was silence. It was sorrow so deep it dried a woman from the inside. Cora had watched it happen, had learned early how to mop blood from handkerchiefs, and lie to neighbors about the cough that ain't much. And when her mother passed, the house grew colder. Not from weather. No, they still lit the hearth, but from the absence of tenderness. She didn't cry. Not then, not now. A door creaked behind her. Footsteps, shuffling. Her father. She didn't turn. She didn't have to. "It's a good match," he said. She waited. "He's got land. And money. You won't go hungry. Not if you behave." She wanted to ask if that was all he'd hoped for her. A full plate in exchange for an empty life. But her throat tightened, thick with unswallowed grief. So she just nodded once, like a soldier accepting orders. "You leave at dawn," he added, and then the door shut again. The next morning, before the light came, she dressed in her Sunday best, the navy blue dress with a hem that always caught on her boots, the sleeves tight around her arms. She'd ironed it herself the night before, even though her hands had shaken. She plaited her hair in 2 braids, not out of vanity, but order. She could control that, at least. They rode in silence. The Baron, whose name she now knew was Harlan Drake, said little, only grunted when her trunk thumped into the wagon bed. He didn't offer a hand. She climbed in herself, her skirts bunching, her spine straight as pine. The trail stretched long and flat, the horizon a yawn of dust and dead grass. She watched the landscape change from home to nowhere to his land, marked by fencing too tall and trees too sharp against the sky. His house rose from the ground like it had been dropped there by a hand that cared more for size than soul. It was large, yes, but wrong, windows like slits, porch too narrow for rocking chairs. No flowers. No signs of life. Inside, it smelled like wax and wood polish. 2 women, neither of whom met her gaze, took her trunk and walked off without words. She was shown to a room. It had a bed, a dresser, and no mirror. At noon, she became Mrs. Drake. No ceremony, just ink on paper and a ring that pinched her finger. He didn't touch her that night, nor did he speak beyond the necessary. His eyes scanned her like livestock. When he shut the door behind him, she sat in the center of the bed and removed her boots slowly, as if unthreading herself from the life she used to know. Days fell into one another. Breakfast at 6. Chores assigned by a head made with cold eyes. Cora was forbidden from the fields, too rough for a lady, Harlan said, yet not invited into any finer graces either. She hovered in between, like a ghost. Furniture was moved around her. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. At supper, he'd say things like "pass the salt, if you can reach it," and chuckle to himself. The laughter never reached his eyes. Once she asked for more bread. He raised an eyebrow and said, "Already had your share, haven't you?" She didn't ask again. In the evenings, she walked the perimeter of the ranch. Not because she hoped for anything, but because her body needed movement. Her heart needed horizon. She whispered to the trees, sang low to herself. Songs her mother used to hum. Songs without names. A month passed. Then another. One afternoon, they rode into town together. He had business. She was told to follow. She wore a brown shawl that did nothing to hide her frame. As they passed the general store, she tripped on a root hidden under loose dirt. Her knees buckled, and she pitched forward. A hand caught her elbow. She looked up. He wasn't striking. Not in the obvious way. His face was sun-lined, his beard close-clipped. His eyes were the color of dry cedar, warm and grave. His hand steadied her, firm but gentle. She whispered, "Thank you." He nodded, then stepped back, tipping his hat. No smirk. No mockery. Harlan scowled and pulled her away by the arm. That night, she was told to stay in her room for speaking to strangers. She didn't dream of the man. Not exactly. But her dreams grew softer. In them, her body didn't ache from walking behind someone. Her name didn't taste like shame. She began to look out the window more. Not in hope, but in memory of that hand, that moment, that absence of cruelty. Her days remained the same. Measured, pale, quiet. But something stirred in her, a resistance she didn't yet name. She started humming aloud. She left wildflowers between the pages of books. She spoke to a cow as she brushed her, telling her secrets, her voice low and human. One evening, as the sun melted low and the wind carried the smell of sage and dust, she stepped outside. The sky was lit with a hush of gold. The world, for one brief moment, felt like it might forgive her. And then her father arrived. He came not with apology, but a smirk, claiming he'd come to see how the deal held up. Harlan laughed. "She eats like a bear, but don't talk like one. I guess that's something." They drank together, two men who had never once asked her what she wanted. She stood in the doorway, hands clenched so tight her knuckles bloomed white. Later that night, her father handed her a package. A dress, smaller than her size. "Wear it next time. Show him you can make the effort." She didn't answer, just watched him mount his horse and ride away without looking back. She sat in the hallway after he left, the dress limp in her lap. She was not a fool. She knew what the world thought of women like her. Too wide for beauty, too tender for power. And yet, she was still here, breathing, holding ground. She stood, folded the dress, and tucked it deep beneath her trunk. She went to bed that night without lighting the lamp. But before she closed her eyes, she whispered a name she didn't know. She said it into the darkness like a seed buried in hope. And somewhere far beyond the fence line, a man stood at his own porch, watching the same moon. And though neither knew it, the wind had begun to change. And change, no matter how quiet, always comes. The Baron's house stood like a verdict, wide and angular, made of dark stone and silent judgment. It rose from the land without grace, without welcome, a structure built not to shelter, but to contain. The windows were narrow slits, sharp-edged and stingy with light. The front door groaned on its hinges each time it opened, as if protesting every arrival. No porch swing, no wildflowers, not even a cracked pot of herbs. Cora stepped across the threshold on the first morning of her new life as Mrs. Drake and felt a cold crawl up her spine. Not from the air, the hearth was lit, the floor polished, but from the absence of anything human. No family portraits, No stitched curtains. No scent of baking or waxy sweetness. Just stone, wood, and silence. The servants didn't speak. They moved around her like wind through dead grass, brisk, emotionless, avoiding her gaze. When she greeted them softly, they offered small nods, nothing more. Even the animals seemed subdued. The stable hands kept to themselves, their eyes full of the kind of weariness that didn't come from labor, but from long-standing resignation. At supper, Harlan Drake sat at the head of a table like a man inspecting a harvest. He carved meat with neat, silent precision and never looked up. When she reached for a second biscuit, he paused. "You sure?" he said, his tone even casual. "Dresses already working hard." She froze, her fingers curling just shy of the plate. His eyes never lifted from his knife. She took her hand back. He never needed to raise his voice. Harlan ruled through quiet disdain, through the tightening of his jaw, through the way he corrected her posture with nothing more than a glance. He did not strike her. He didn't need to. His disappointment was sharper than fists and far more constant. At night, he retired to his study. She learned quickly not to knock. Her room, though spacious, was stripped of comfort. The bedding was stiff, the mirror removed, the window facing nothing but the side of the barn. She kept her trunk closed, her dresses neatly folded, her dreams pressed between silence and obligation. On the third morning, she dared to ask for a ride. "To where?" he said, without looking up from his coffee. "Just around the property." He sipped slowly. "And why would that be?" She swallowed. "To learn the land. Help if I can." A chuckle slid from his throat. "You're not here to help, Cora. You're here to behave." She nodded. She always nodded now. But her spirit, though bruised, had not shattered. Not entirely. She began to walk the grounds on her own. Not far, just the edges, where the fields met the forest. Her boots found paths worn by deer and wind. She memorized the trees by their shadows, counted the clouds when her thoughts grew too loud. She talked to herself in murmurs, hummed hymns no one would hear, and whispered prayers she wasn't sure she believed anymore. She tended to a half-blind barn cat she found mewling beneath the eaves, fed it bits of meat, and named it Sparrow. The cat never came close, but it stayed, and that small loyalty stitched a soft thread into her days. Every week, Harlan traveled into town to speak with bankers, buy supplies, or drink at the saloon. She rode beside him in silence, a figure draped in shadow, her bonnet pulled low. He would hand her a list, never asking if she could read, though she could, better than he'd guessed. She completed each errand precisely, placing coins with care, collecting parcels without chatter. The townspeople looked at her sideways. She was the wife of a man they feared. Pity and curiosity curled in their glances, but none dared offer kindness. Until the stumble. It happened outside the post office. A root curled beneath the dry soil, hidden under her hem. Her ankle turned. Her knees buckled. She didn't hit the ground. A hand caught her. Firm, calloused, warm. She looked up. He was taller than most, lean but solid, with skin browned by sun and wind. His clothes were simple, denim and flannel worn thin at the elbows. His eyes were the color of cedar bark, deep and steady. He didn't speak, just nodded once and released her arm. She managed a breath. "Thank you." His gaze didn't linger. He tipped his hat and moved on. It lasted seconds, but her body carried the memory like a pressed flower. Not for romance, not yet, but for something rarer, recognition. That night, Harlan didn't mention it. But the next morning, her breakfast plate was noticeably lighter. Half a biscuit. No butter. A glance that said everything. The punishment was always subtle, always specific. Days blurred. The house pressed inward. Her dresses grew tighter as the seams betrayed her. Whether from shrinking or restriction, she couldn't say. New garments arrived, stitched narrow at the waist. A maid offered to help lace her in, her hands firm and unkind. Harlan watched her at meals, his eyes sweeping over her like a farmer surveying flawed goods. When she refused dessert, he smirked. Progress. She learned to eat in secret, crusts tucked under sleeves, spoonfuls of honey taken when no one watched. She wasn't ashamed. She was surviving. One morning, he summoned her to the parlor. "You'll deliver this," he said, holding a folded envelope. "To the ranch south of ours. Elias Boone." The name didn't echo, but her heart stirred without cause. "Don't dawdle," he added. "He's not one for company." She rode out on a gray mare borrowed from stables, the letter tucked into her pocket. The wind was high that day, tugging her shawl and whipping her braid loose. She followed the road south, past the crooked trees and shallow creek, until the house came into view. It was smaller than Drake's, weathered and wide-porched, with 2 chairs worn smooth by use. The land around it was clean, but not tamed. A few chickens wandered near the gate. A dog lifted its head, blinked, and lay back down. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. She dismounted, brushed her skirt, and stepped forward. "I have a letter," she said. He nodded. She handed it over. He took it, fingers grazing hers for a second too long to be accident. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded. A pause stretched between them, not awkward, just unspoken. He looked past her, to the hills. "Rain's coming." She turned toward the sky. "Feels like it." "You ride out in it?" She hesitated. "I've ridden in worse." He stepped aside. "You can wait it out if you'd like." She entered the porch's shade, the first cool moment she'd felt in weeks. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and coffee. A fire burned low in the hearth. A stack of books sat beside the chair. The walls were bare, but the room breathed. Warmth lived here. Not decoration, not polish. Just comfort. He poured her a cup of water, handed it over without a word. She drank slow. Said, "You live alone?" "For now." She didn't ask more. He didn't offer. The rain arrived not in torrents, but a slow pattering that hushed the world. They sat in silence. He spoke first. "You new to the county?" She considered. "New to this version of it." He nodded. "Hard place for new things." She looked at him then. Not his hands, not his clothes, but his eyes. They weren't kind. They were honest. That was rarer. She left when the sky cleared, the silence between them unbroken, but not unfinished. When she returned home, the house looked grayer, colder. Harlan didn't ask where she'd been. The maids didn't greet her. But that night, she sat by the small window in her room and whispered, "Elias." Just the name. Nothing more. Like a coin tossed into a wishing well, not expecting a miracle, but needing to try. The days afterward wore the same face, meals, tasks, silence. But something had shifted. She found herself humming more. She tucked flowers into empty jars. She drew tiny animals in the corners of the books Harlan never touched. Not rebellion, just small acts of preservation. Sparrow, the cat, now followed her. At a distance, but faithfully. The world didn't soften, but she did not surrender. And sometimes, when she stood at the edge of the property, she imagined what it might be like to hear her name spoken not like a sentence, but like a song. The Baron's house remained cold, but somewhere beyond its reach, warmth waited. And even the frost, given time, begins to thaw. The frost had thinned by early March, leaving the earth damp beneath its thaw, and the air full of scents that whispered of life returning. Cora walked the fence line with her shawl drawn close and her breath fogging before her, eyes scanning the land not with hope, but with a quiet ache that something might change. The letter came folded in the pocket of Harlan's coat. He tossed it on the table with a grunt. Boone sent word. "That calf he bought off me got sick. Says I sold him bad stock." She picked up the envelope. It was unopened. Her fingers brushed the seal. "You want me to send a reply?" He waved his hand like swatting a fly. "Deliver it in person. Take the cart. You'll tell him I don't send weak calves. He can look at your bones and see we don't breed for frailty." The barb sliced quick and clean. She turned away before it could show on her face. That afternoon, she drove the cart south. The wheels rolled over soft ruts in the warming earth. Crows cawed overhead, their black shapes circling low. Sparrow, ever more bold, had hopped into the back before she left, curling in the straw beside a sack of oats. She let him come. It felt good to not travel alone. Elias Boone's ranch appeared over the crest of the hill, the fencing long and weathered but mended with care. The trees near his house had buds at the tips, pink as lips about to speak. The porch still held its 2 chairs, and a coat was hung neatly on the rail. She saw him before he saw her, chopping wood at the side of the barn, his sleeves rolled up, his shirt damp at the chest. His body moved with ease, not hurried, not proud, just purposeful. He looked up when the cart rattled into view. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but not the absence of one either. She stepped down, smoothing her skirts. The fabric clung slightly from the dampness. Sparrow leapt after her, stretching like a prince in the sun. "Afternoon," she said. Elias leaned the axe against the stump. "Didn't expect company." She held out the letter. "Your calf." Harlan sent word. He took it. Didn't open it. Just held it a moment before slipping it into his coat pocket. "You want to come in?" he asked. She hesitated. "I don't bite," he added, almost kindly. The corners of her mouth moved without her permission. She followed him inside. The house was the same as before, warm, lived in, quiet as a prayer. The fire was lit, and a pot of something savory simmered on the stove. He poured her a cup of water and gestured to the same chair she'd sat in before. Sparrow wandered in, tail high, and without hesitation leapt onto a windowsill. Elias looked at the cat and then at her. "Yours." "Sort of. He keeps his own counsel." He nodded as if that made sense. "Most things worth keeping do." She didn't reply. They sat for a time, the only sound the pop of the fire and the occasional scrape of the cat's claws against wood. "I didn't sell you bad stock," he said after a while. "I didn't think you had." "You believe that easy?" She looked down at her cup. "Not easy. Just. I saw how you looked at that calf. Like it mattered." A long pause. "Then most things do." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't a compliment. Just a truth shared across the table. She stayed longer than she meant to. The sky shifted from silver to pale gold. He offered her stew. She accepted. They ate in silence, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind that made room. She spoke first this time. "You always live alone?" He nodded. "Since I was 16. No family. Had some. Time took 'em." She didn't press. She knew the shape of grief well enough to leave it untouched. He said, "You don't talk much either." "I used to, but it didn't change anything. Still won't. But sometimes it eases the weight." Her hands curled in her lap. She said, "I used to sing. My mama said my voice sounded like honey over snow." "You stop." She nodded. "Why?" No one wanted to hear it. He looked at her then, not just glanced, but truly looked. "That don't mean it stopped being true." The words landed softly, but they stayed. When she rose to leave, he walked her to the cart. The evening air had chilled again. He didn't offer a coat, just stood close enough that the wind seemed to pause. "Come back sometime," he said. She didn't answer, but her silence wasn't refusal. Back at the Baron's house, Harlan didn't ask how the visit went. He didn't notice the tiny pink blossom tucked behind her ear, either. Spring crept across the plains with slow feet. Trees began to wake. The fields greened in patches. Birds returned to the rafters. Cora found reasons to visit the southern fence line more often. A calf had wandered through. A loose board needed inspecting. She took a longer route to town and stopped by Boone's to rest the mare. He never asked her to stay, never leaned too close. But he always had something waiting: coffee, a story, a silence that held her without pressing in. One afternoon, she brought him a pie she'd made in secret. It wasn't pretty. The crust cracked, the filling leaked at the edges. He looked at it like it was gold. "Blackberry," she said. "Not much sugar." He nodded solemnly. "I'll ration it for a week." She smirked. "Liar." He grinned. 2 days tops. They ate it together on the porch. The wind was light, the sky wide and forgiving. "I like it here," she said. He didn't answer right away. Then, "You look more like yourself here." She turned to him. "You don't even know me." Don't need to know all of someone to see who they are. The words swelled in her chest, pressing against ribs that had held too much for too long. She said very quietly, "I don't want to be a secret." He didn't flinch. didn't promise anything he couldn't. Instead, he said, "When the time comes, I won't let you be." That was enough. That night, she dreamed of her mother's voice again. Not the coughing, but the singing. The dream stayed. So did she. One day, he asked if she'd like to help him mend the fence. She nodded. They worked side by side, boots in the dirt, hands splintered and calloused. He passed her nails, held the board steady as she hammered. Their arms brushed now and then, not by design, but by the nature of closeness. It rained suddenly, the kind of spring rain that came like a secret and left like a song. They ducked under the barn's eave, soaked and laughing softly. He reached up, brushed a strand of wet hair from her face. His hand lingered for half a heartbeat. "You're not what they say," he murmured. "I know," she whispered. They stood there, rain washing the world clean around them, and neither said more. It wasn't time yet, but the fence between them, literal and otherwise, had begun to fall. She left only when the sun returned. He walked her to the gate. She looked back before riding off. He raised his hand. Not a wave. A vow. She carried it with her all the way home. The wind changed first, low and constant, curling around the house like a warning muttered under breath. Cora felt it before she saw it, in the shift of the mare's gait, in Sparrow's restlessness, in the way her apron strings fluttered despite the stillness of the trees. Something had turned, though nothing yet had broken. She had not returned from Elias's ranch empty. She carried in her chest a quiet knowing, a warmth that refused to extinguish. She moved differently now, still softly, but with a current running beneath. Her eyes met mirrors more often. Her lips hummed again. But Harlan noticed. Not at first, not with words, but in the length of his gaze across the supper table. In the way he asked her fewer questions, but left more orders. The air thickened around him, like a storm that brooded just beyond sight. One morning, he spoke without looking up from his ledger. "You've been walking farther than usual." She folded a dish towel, voice steady. "The southern fence needs checking." "You like it down there?" She did not flinch. "It's quiet." "Too quiet, maybe." She said nothing. The room held its breath. That afternoon, she found her saddle worn wrong, buckles reversed, stirrups shortened. Her mare flinched at her touch. She noticed a welt on the animal's side, just under the flank. Her throat clenched, hands curling uselessly at her sides. She whispered, "I'm sorry," to the horse, pressing her forehead to its warm neck. Someone had sent a message. She began riding only when necessary, when she could explain it, when others could see. Still, the eyes of the ranch hands lingered longer than they should have. Whispers grew where silence used to live. Harlan's presence became more frequent. He stayed home more, spoke less, drank more. He loomed. One evening, she returned from the smokehouse with arms full of cured pork, only to find one of Harlan's men leaning against the barn door, chewing a sprig of sage like it might spit answers. "You sure make long trips for someone who don't like town," he said, gaze sliding over her like grease. She didn't stop walking. "Man might wonder where a woman like you finds comfort. Sure ain't here." Still she walked. The meat weighed nothing compared to his voice. Inside, her hands trembled. She dropped one slab on the floor. Sparrow rubbed against her ankles, sensing the storm in her bones. That night, she bolted her door. Elias knew nothing of it. She hadn't dared return, not yet. But she thought of him when the house grew too quiet, when the walls leaned close. She replayed his voice, the way it didn't hurry, the way it didn't hurt. One dawn, unable to hold it anymore, she saddled the mare and rode out before the sun had burned off the mist. The fields were silvered with dew. The air smelled of wet soil and mercy. Elias was by the orchard, trimming back the apple trees before they bloomed too early. He looked up as she approached, and whatever worry had lived in his eyes washed out at the sight of her. "I shouldn't stay long," she said. He nodded, took the reins, tied off the horse. He didn't ask why her voice cracked or why her hands refused to still. Inside, she sat before the fire without asking. "I can't keep pretending I'm not being watched," she said. "You're not safe. I'm not free." He crouched beside her chair. Not touching, just near. Tell me. She did. Not everything, but enough. About the bruises not on her skin, the mockery laced through every word. The warnings that crept like weeds. The man by the barn. The mark on the mare. He didn't speak when she finished. He just stood, paced once, and then said, "You won't go back alone." "I can't leave. Not yet. Not like this. He owns the land, the papers." "You're not a paper." She stood. "No. But I've been treated like one." He opened his mouth, closed it again, then said quieter, "When you're ready, I'll be here." Her breath shivered in her chest. "I believe you." She left before noon. Rode back with her chin high, daring anyone to ask. Harlan didn't. But that night, her trunk had been moved. Her dresses scattered. Underthings hung from the wardrobe like trophies. He stood by the window, sipping from a flask. "You think I don't see what's happening?" he said. She said nothing. "Women like you don't get rescued. You get ruined." Her voice, when it came, surprised them both. "Then you don't know women like me." He threw the flask. It shattered against the wall. But she didn't flinch. Later, in the barn, the wind howled louder than any scream. The sky cracked open with thunder that rattled the boards. Lightning flashed, illuminating the stalls. Smoke. She smelled it before she saw it. The far end of the barn was lit with flickering orange. Fire. The Baron's prize bulls, penned near the flames, bellowed and thrashed. The ranch hands hadn't come. The house still slept. She didn't wait. Grabbing the rope and a pitchfork, she threw open the side gate and ran in. Heat slapped her skin. Smoke choked her lungs. She shouted, waved, drove the panicked animals toward the gate. Sparks caught on the straw near her feet. The bulls charged past, barely avoiding her. One clipped her shoulder. She spun, hit the dirt, but rose again. The beam above groaned. Fire climbed like a curse. A shadow moved. Then hands caught her, pulled her from the smoke. Elias. She didn't ask how he got there. Didn't care. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders, guided her into the grass. She coughed hard, knees buckling. He held her. "You ran into a burning barn," he said. They were alive. His mouth was a thin line. His eyes burned brighter than the fire. In the distance, men yelled. Too late. The barn collapsed with a shriek. She lay back in the grass, soaked with sweat and ash, his arms still beneath her shoulders. "I can't go back in," she whispered. "You won't." The sheriff arrived by sunup, not because of her, but because Harlan raged into town blaming sabotage. Elias said nothing, but Cora did. "I ran in alone. I saved the cattle." He was still asleep. The sheriff looked from one to the other. "You two need to tell me the rest," he said. But neither did. Not yet. She stayed at Elias's that day. Sparrow came too, curling beside the hearth as if he'd lived there all his life. She washed the ash from her skin, ate soup, slept. When she woke, the storm had passed. And so had something else. That evening, Elias handed her a new pair of gloves. Soft leather, sized just for her. "For fixing fences," he said. She looked at him, and for the first time in years, she smiled without fear. The town was different in the early morning light, hushed, silver-skinned, carrying the hush of something not yet spoken. Cora stood just inside Elias's barn, the hem of her dress brushing the earth, a breath caught in the quiet before the day turned sharp. The fire scars on her hands had begun to peel, pink and healing, tender as fresh petals. Sparrow sat near the door, tail flicking slow, watching the world with an unbothered grace she envied. She'd spent 3 days and nights on Elias's land, no longer hiding, but not yet stepping into the full truth. People had started to talk. They always did. But this time, the words didn't hollow her out. They filled the air like pollen, unavoidable, but no longer toxic. Elias moved through the morning like a man who never asked for more than he needed and never gave less than was right. He spoke little, but she had learned to read the silences between his gestures. In the way he set a cup for her before she asked. The way he paused when walking past her, not with uncertainty, but quiet deference. And when his hand brushed hers as they worked the gate, it lingered only long enough to be remembered. The sheriff came just past noon. He didn't knock, just nodded toward Elias and dismounted slow. His boots made the porch creak in a way that sounded like news arriving. "You got time?" he asked. Elias nodded. Cora stepped forward too, chin high. "I do." The sheriff looked between them. A good man, but tired, like most men in positions too small to fix big wrongs. "Drake's pressing charges," he said. "Says you started the fire. Says you're hiding here, without cause." Cora swallowed, but her voice came steady. "Then he can say it to my face." They rode into town not in secrecy, but in sunlight. The trail dust swirled behind them like a ghost unwilling to let go. When they reached the square, people paused, at water barrels, porches, window panes. Eyes followed her, but not all with judgment. Word had spread. About the barn, the bulls, her burns. She stepped down from Elias's horse, spine straight, face open. She no longer wore shame like a second skin. She wore truth. Harlan waited near the jailhouse, arms crossed, lips thin. His coat was too fine, too clean. His expression held the rot of a man used to winning by force or silence. "You think hiding with him's going to fix anything?" he snapped. Cora didn't flinch. "I wasn't hiding. I was healing." He scoffed. "You ran. You set fire to my property. You took what wasn't yours." "I was sold," she said. "I was given like livestock. And I still tried to save what you cared about more than me." A hush fell. The sheriff cleared his throat. "She pulled those bulls out herself, Harlan. I saw the burns. She had help." "I arrived after," Elias said. "Convenient." The sheriff turned to the crowd. "Any other witnesses?" A murmur spread. Then a voice from the store, Mrs. Withers, stout and sharp-eyed. "I saw her leave at dawn that morning," she called. "Alone. I watched from the window." A second voice, Jacob from the blacksmith shop. "I seen her ride toward Boone's." Alone again. The tide began to shift. Harlan stepped forward. "You think you can just walk away from this?" "From me?" "I was never yours," Cora said. "Not to love. Not to sell." He sneered. "You think anyone will stand with you when this passes? When the story fades?" Elias moved then, not quick, but deliberate. He stepped beside her, hand brushing her back. "I will." No applause followed. No cheers. Just a silence deeper than any courtroom. The sheriff nodded once. "I won't jail a woman for saving animals and herself. If Drake wants to press charges, he'll need more than bitterness." Harlan stared, jaw flexing. But he saw it. The shift. The loss. Not just of control, but of the perception that once protected him. The town no longer looked away. He mounted his horse and rode off, kicking dust that didn't settle. Cora exhaled. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply stood there, watching the horizon reclaim him. Later, back at the ranch, she sat with Elias beneath the old cedar tree. The breeze combed through the branches like fingers through a lover's hair. A jug of water sat between them. Sparrow sprawled in the shade, belly to the sky. "I thought it would feel louder," she said. "What?" "Freedom." He looked at her, eyes soft. "Some things come quiet, like rivers carving stone." She looked down at her hands, still healing. "What now?" "That depends. You want to stay here?" "I don't want a man to keep me." "I won't." She smiled. "But I'd like to stay near." He reached for her hand, not to possess, but to offer. "I'd like that too." She laced her fingers through his. They sat like that until the sky turned lavender. Weeks passed. The land bloomed. Wildflowers spilled across the hills like forgiveness. Cora began helping Elias with the fence, this time not as a guest, but as a partner. She mended boards, hammered nails, laughed when the wind stole her hat. She wrote letters for neighbors who couldn't write. She started singing again, just in the mornings, low and sleepy. People began to visit. Not many, but enough. Women brought her bread. A child brought a drawing. A man with one leg brought her a saddlebag and said, "Folks are proud." She never wore the navy dress again. She kept it folded in the chest, not out of anger, but memory. A reminder of who she'd been, what she'd endured. Elias carved her name into a beam in the barn. Just her first name. Deep, careful. She planted lavender along the front walk. It took root quick. One night, as they watched the stars blink open, she said, "Do you think people like me are meant for peace? You're not like anything I've ever known." That's not an answer. He smiled, voice slow. "You're not meant for suffering, Cora. You're meant for whatever you choose." She leaned into him. "Then I choose this." And in that moment, beneath a sky older than sorrow, she did. Years later, they would say a woman lived on the Boone land who once walked through fire to save beasts no one else would, who stood before a town and spoke not with fury, but truth. They said her hands grew roses and her voice returned the sun after hard winters. And if you asked her why she stayed, she'd tell you this: some reckonings don't come with noise. Some arrive in the form of a quiet man, a cedar tree, and a love strong enough not to rescue you, but to believe you didn't need rescuing at all. And that, more than anything, changed everything.